Calais, June 18, 1940. The city that had fed soldiers and merchants for generations fell quiet as columns of troops filed away and a provisional order declared an end to active resistance. 8 weeks of fighting had left tens of thousands dead and more than 1 million displaced, families spilling onto roads like slow rivers of need. Across the channel, a defiant voice on the radio vowed to carry on, promising fight and hope and no surrender. For those in the occupied towns, that pledge sounded both like an answer and an accusation. In one bakery, a school teacher folded a note into her apron and wrote that the fighting must stop, that survival mattered more than glory. On a wharf, a fisherman watched the channel lights blink and muttered that if Britain stood alone, then perhaps his son still had a future. Their reactions would not line up neatly. They would split by class, by age, by proximity to the front, and by personal loss. This is a study of how ordinary civilians read defeat and how an ally who refused to yield became a mirror that amplified fear, shame, rage, and at times a stubborn ember of resistance. We will move from small, intimate moments to a public incident that altered opinion. Follow the ripple through neighborhoods and regions and ask what it meant to live under occupation. When another nation would not surrender. The immediate division of opinion was visible in public squares and private kitchens. In the municipal office, Mayor Lucien Durand signed a document he called pragmatic and necessary, saying simply that the town could not feed another month of shells and blood. He smelled of smoke and boiled cabbage, his hands stained with ink and soot. In the same afternoon, a young factory worker named Pierre Laurent climbed onto an empty crate in the Union Hall and shouted that surrender was shame, that sons should not be given up without a fight. The Union Hall tasted of metal and coal dust, voices rough as gravel. A widow named Aline Moreau kept to her bed, her voice small, confessing that she had lost 3 brothers and wanted only to bury them. An Algerian woman who had come to the docks as a refugee, Fatima Ben Youssef, held a fading photograph and said that any chance for her children to live mattered more than politics. Sounds of the city changed. The radio was a new altar. The BBC transmissions were heard in basements and cafes, carried on shortwave and whispered in kitchens, and they created an impossible intimacy with promises from across the sea. Smells of bread, damp wool, and the metallic tang of rationed tea filled rooms where people argued. 3 dialogues show the texture of those divisions. In the Union Hall, Pierre said to Lucien, "I will not live under shame." Lucien replied, "You talk of honor, but we are starving." Pierre answered, "Honor is what keeps the children from becoming captives of fear." Lucien said, "And who will feed them if we are all dead?" Pierre said, "We die with dignity." In a bakery, Aline said to the teacher Marie-Louise, "I dream of silence." Marie-Louise asked, "Silence at what cost?" Aline said, "Better silence than daily terror." Marie-Louise said, "And then what do our children inherit?" Aline said, "A roof, perhaps." On the wharf, Pierre spoke to Fatima, "I hear Britain alive on the air." Fatima said, "The voice is music and terror at once." Pierre said, "Music gives strength." Fatima said, "Strength without bread is still hunger." Those exchanges captured the texture of debate and the sensory world of each place, the smell of wet rope and fish, the roughness of coal dust under fingernails, the glare of searchlights on wet cobblestones, the timid glow of a candle in a cellar, and the metallic rasp of newspapers folded and refolded like talismans. Regional divides deepened those fractures. In port towns where ships still slipped out at dawn, men like Captain Henri Renaud argued that naval strength meant leverage, and they counted the tonnage of ships and the number of officers who remained loyal. Inland, in the suburbs, shopkeepers and peasants imagined occupation as a long winter in which rules would change slowly and taxes would grow. In a mountain village, people whispered about collaboration and survival, trading flour for silence. Names piled up as proof of complexity. Among others, there were Sister Claire, who hid school books under mattresses, Bernard Petit, who ran a clandestine press from his attic, Odette Marchand, who translated BBC bulletins for neighbors, Marcel Dupont, who denounced a co-worker for speaking too loudly about resistance, and Captain Thomas Mallory, the British radio operator, whose voice from far away became both comfort and torment. The senses returned in these vignettes. Piles of wood smoke in a chapel, the chalky taste of barley soup, the damp of cellars used to shelter refugees, the squeal of cartwheels on cobbles, the faint copper odor of a letter stamped and sealed. Arguments crossed class lines. In cafes by noon, the chatter was bitter and fast. In estates, the owners feared looting more than ideology. In factories, machines whispered their indifferent rhythm as workers debated whether to obey union calls or flee. The incident that catalyzed a moral earthquake came with steel and noise. News reached the city that a British squadron had engaged French ships that were believed at risk of falling into enemy hands. Reports were messy and contradictory. Some said the British had struck without warning to prevent assets being seized. Another said they had tried to disarm and been met with fire. Whatever the exact naval logic, civilians heard of sailors killed and boats sunk, and the word betrayal passed quickly like smoke. In the market, men traded rumors as if they were precious coins. The first reaction was stunned silence, then a howl of anger. A dialogue in the market shows the split. A butcher named Emile,
"They shot our brothers!" A shopkeeper named René replied, "They prevented a worse thing." Emile said, "They betrayed us." René said, "They saved the sea for others." Emile said, "I saw the faces pulled from the water." The sensory detail crowded the scene, the metallic stink of diesel, the wool of wet coats clinging to shoulders, the cold of June rain soaked into sleeves. The taste of salt hung in air like accusation. Propaganda seized on the event. Leaflets and clandestine radio reports painted it as calculated cruelty. The occupier newspaper used the moment to demand calm and present it as proof that surrender was the only humane choice. The BBC aired rebuttals and sorrowful registers, and the word collaboration and the accusation of betrayal spread through letters, whispered denunciations, and public demonstrations. What followed was a surge of emotional contagion that slowly turned grief into anger, and anger into a new kind of resolve. Small acts multiplied. Bernard Petit printed leaflets hidden in looms. Odette Marchand wrote translations of foreign bulletins and slipped them into bread sacks. Sister Claire taught children to memorize names and dates to keep memory alive. 5 moments of tension marked the turning point in the city and its surroundings. The first came on a tram, where a man confronted a sailor home on leave and a fight erupted that middle-aged women had to pull apart. The second was at a family door, when a neighbor denounced a man for hiding a radio, and the police took him away into a van, leaving a child at the threshold. The third was an illegal meeting in a cellar, where voices rose and the rafters shuddered as men argued whether to sabotage a railway line that would surely invite reprisals. Each of these moments held 500 to 600 characters of concentrated dread and decision. The squeal of boots up stone steps, the bright flaring of a match to read a manifesto, the metallic clink of a lid sealing a jar with secret notes inside. Reprisals came with rounding up men and women for ostensibly minor infractions, and with sudden requisitions that stripped households of valuables. The cost of private decisions became visible. Some who had argued for pragmatic acceptance were arrested and never returned. Others who had advocated resistance faced the death of a brother in a raid. The social fabric strained and at times tore. Repression and courage braided together in public corridors and private rooms. A clandestine network organized by Lucien and Bernard stole food lists from the town hall and rerouted rations to families with children. Aline Moreau hid passports in loaves of bread. Pierre Laurent and 3 other workers dismantled machinery at night to delay production for the occupier, while at the same time smuggling medical supplies to a hospital in the next district. The sensory world there was precise. The cold metal of a wrench, the oily smell of machine grease, the whisper of cloth smothering a radio, the foul
sweetness of stolen medicine hidden under floorboards. Dialogues of decision show the moral geometry. Lucien asked Marie-Louise, "Can we risk this many lives for a hope that might be crushed?" Marie-Louise answered, "If no one risks hope, then what remains?" Lucien said, "I only see coffins." Marie-Louise said, "I only see futures we have not yet given them." There were technical descriptions of clandestine work, how fake permits were forged with old typewriters and ink ground in a mortar, how radios were tuned to BBC frequencies and shielded with cloth to avoid detection, how secret caches were mapped to bakeries and attics. Names of the secondary actors accumulated to show networks. Among them were Inspector Marcel Leclerc, who turned a blind eye to some transfers; Elodie Garnier, who sewed messages into coats; André Besson, who acted as courier; Louise Caron, who ferried children to safe houses; and Captain Mallory, whose broadcasts were decoded and rebroadcast in a dozen homes. Time complicated every simple moral judgment. In a long backstory of Marie-Louise Fournier, we see how her choices were not abstract. Marie-Louise was born in 1906 to a schoolmaster and a seamstress. She trained as a teacher in the city and spent her 20s organizing night classes for laborers learning to read. She married once and lost her husband in a small skirmish at the frontier before the city fell. She remembered the laughter of children in the schoolyard and the way light fell across chalk dust. When the first bombs came, she hid books in bread boxes and taught with gestures and stories. The war had taken her brother, a baker, and left her mother ill from the cold. Her faith in the idea of national dignity was steady, but her faith in policies that cost lives was brittle. She kept a diary in which she wrote questions to herself and to history about duty and survival. In the months leading up to the surrender, she had counseled pupils to memorize poetry and maps, and in secret taught arithmetic to children whose fathers had vanished. Her backstory explains why she sometimes signed clandestine leaflets and at other times counseled restraint. She wanted to preserve both lives and values, and she understood that courage might mean a hidden kindness as much as a loud refusal. This section is both a record of small domestic rituals and of the heavy arithmetic of grief. It accounts for why she would shelter a BBC receiver under a bed, yet argue in public for temporary quiet, and it gives weight to the decisions that would later look like contradictions. As the months moved on, reactions evolved. 1 month after the surrender, the city had a brittle quiet. Curfews cut evenings short, and ration lines were longer. Some who had once shouted for resistance nodded when order was restored. The 1-month epilogue shows kitchens sparse but functioning, the baker Pierre serving bread with a look that was half relief and half shame, the wharf empty at dawn, and the BBC broadcast still a soft thread of otherness. 3 months later, clandestine networks were stronger, not because the occupier had softened, but because people had found discreet ways to help. Teachers like Marie-Louise taught children a coded curriculum of memory, and Sister Claire had a ledger of names of those she had hid. 6 months in, the pattern had shifted further. The initial anger after the naval incident had broadened into a hard memory and had been folded into a narrative of betrayal for some and of necessary sacrifice for others. The 3-month entry records how Odette translated bulletins and children learned songs from foreign airwaves. The 6-month entry records how some families moved away entirely, how collaboration had become both an accusation and a survival strategy, and how a quiet form of resistance based on saving lives rather than winning battles had come to define many neighborhoods. Across these months there were small liberations, a baby born to a family who had hidden in a cellar, a letter delivered to a prisoner of war, a bakery that refused to hand over its list of clients. Hope was narrow and stubborn. The epilogue as a whole shows the arc from shock to adaptation and from fragmentation to a brittle solidarity that would matter when larger events again reshaped the map. Around the point where these stories have settled into the city's memory, it is worth pausing and asking you a question. You have just heard voices that pull in opposite directions, voices that plead for safety and others that demand resistance and sacrifice. That is understandable and confusing. If you were a resident then, with a family, with food running low and bombs at the periphery, what would you choose? Would you write security or resistance and add one sentence explaining why? Your short answer helps us see how decisions are not only political but deeply personal. Share a story if you have one. Your comment belongs to a conversation about how people live impossible choices. Now we return to the narrative. In the closing chapters, the complexity increases. Some who had once collaborated switched to secret aid, haunted by what they had done. Others who had denounced neighbors lived the rest of their lives unable to explain their choices. The language of betrayal and collaboration became legal and moral currency in trials and in whispered confrontations. The occupier used propaganda to name enemies and friends and tried to sway the elderly who remembered old treaties and old allegiances. The BBC and foreign broadcasts remained a contested source of solace and danger. The last scenes show the long shadow of these months. A child who learned from Marie-Louise would carry the memory of codified lessons into post-war life. A baker who chose survival over resistance would remarry and never speak of the hidden passports in the oven. The network that began as leaflets and quiet deliveries matured into a movement that could shelter troops and guide escapes by night. The narrative closes on a composite image, the grated light through a cellar door, a stack of letters tied with twine, the echo of a distant broadcast, and a woman who keeps 2 photographs in her apron, one of a brother lost at sea, and one of a man who risked his life to save a neighbor. Some felt relief, some felt betrayal, some found ways to resist without guns. The city learned that defeat can reshape honor, and that the refusal of an ally to surrender can become both a beacon and a wound. If these stories moved you, write your thought below and consider subscribing for more episodes that examine how ordinary people make impossible choices. In the end, memory is not a single verdict. It is a stitched cloth of small mercies, bitter compromises, acts of courage and acts of shame. What endures is not always heroism in the public sense, but the way ordinary people try to keep each other alive.